tend to think that the underground works on electricity. Yeah, it doesn't. The thing that makes the underground work is tea.
I think I sat next to Joanna Lumley once, and I think I sat next to either Ant or Dick. I don't know which one it was.
The next station is Finchley Road. Change for the Jubilee line.
Please mind the gap between the train and the platform.
I once fell on the tracks on the train, so I didn't mind the gap.
By 1905, the Underground was just starting running electric trains on the inner circle. So my grandfather got a job, and his job was called a conductor. So on the circle trains, as well as a driver and a guard, there were people all the way down the train that worked the gates to let people on off at stations, and they were called conductors. The Underground decided they didn't need so many staff on the trains, and they changed the way the trains operated. They rebuilt them a little bit. So my grandfather didn't have a job on the trains for very long, only a short number of years. And then he got a job working on the stations, and one of the main stations he worked at was Aldgate. That was probably about 1910, something like that. He was working near the ticket barrier, and he heard a shout, a scream from the escalator. And it turned out a young man had been riding up the escalator, and the soles of his shoes had got caught in the mechanism of the escalator near the top. And my grandfather ran across and lifted him up physically, pulled him out of his shoes and cleared the escalator. And while he was working at Aldgate, one of the surprising things was that's where he met his wife, because she used to travel from where she worked in Kensington. She used to travel home every weekend to West Ham, and used to go to Aldgate on the train and then get the tram from there. And that's how she met my grandfather. And so my grandfather carried on working on the stations on the Underground through the First War and all the way through the rest of his career.
When they made the Underground, when they were building it, all the dirt and all everything coming out from the Underground, they were just going to go and dump it. But one of the directors of Chelsea said, look, we'll have all that earth, bring it over to the ground. So they brought it, and that earth managed to, because it wasn't a football pitch before, so they built it up at the sides, at the back, and that's where they turned it into the terracing.
The Metropolitan, it goes through an area that he called Metroland. You see, that's metropolitan and land. But you could go out there and buy lovely houses in the country with lots of lovely gardens, and the railways and the people who were selling the houses worked together, and so you got leafy suburbs out, you see, from Wembley and Rickmansworth and out to Amersham.
In 1932, when he left school, and he would have been 15 then, my father got a job as a temporary junior booking clerk on the Metropolitan Railway. When it came to the Second World War, when London was bombed, a lot of damage was done to the Underground and to London transport buildings generally. But my father's job, as soon as that damage was reported, my father had to arrange with the people checking out that damage, make sure the rubble was cleared away, bring in lorries with new materials and contractors to do the repairs.
During the war, when the air raid sounded, you always had to go to your shelter. Lots of people went to the Underground. People thought that Leicester Square was the deepest underground, and people went down, took their bedding with them, or a camp bed, and they went to bed on the platform. Some of them, believe it or not, went and slept on the line. They turned the electricity off and they slept there, hoping that when the bombs dropped, they would be safe. When I got on the Bakerloo line from Piccadilly Circus and arrived at Wembley Park, And I did that 3 times because I went to the 3, and they were wonderful times. Because although the war was on, when you go to a football match, you can get rid of some of the worries that are in your mind.
From the mid-50s, London Transport recruited workers from the Barbados for the underground. I left Barbados at 6 o'clock in the morning on the 6th of April, 1961, flew to Idlewild Airport, that is now Kennedy Airport, then on to London, where London Transport coaches picked us up. There was about 50 of us, and took us to various accommodations around London. And then by the 8th of April, we were at work. I didn't last long on the bus. I didn't like the buses at all. I wasn't accustomed to the bus was going around the corner and I was going a different direction. I didn't like that. So I asked if I could be given another job. Yes, and said, okay, we'll send you to the underground. And I was transferred to the underground. Earliest memories when I went on the underground, I didn't know which direction the train was going. Luckily, I had a lady with me, and she knew the underground. She was starting at the same time as me, and she was able to point the directions the train was going. I didn't understand north, south, east or west. I was completely lost. You had to be up sometimes 3:30 in the morning to get to work. Or you much finish at 1 o'clock in the morning. You wouldn't get home until 2 o'clock in the morning. Those were the bits I didn't like. I wasn't happy sweeping the platforms either. I've never done that before. Cleaning glass windows, cleaning the booking office, cleaning brass, didn't like it. I done it for 6 months, and it was enjoyable during the day, until I applied to become a train guard. I enjoyed being a train driver the most. Strictly speaking, you were your own boss. Nobody to bother you, nobody to tell you what to do. You knew what you were doing. Originally, I felt like an airline pilot. I liked that very much. When I became a station inspector, I was thinking of going back because I didn't like that at all. You're at the station and you get all the questions fired at you from left, right, and centre. Where's Buckingham Palace? Where's the House of Commons? But I preferred to be a train driver because nobody could ask you anything. This house is when I became a senior manager. This is the badge of authority. With this job, you got paid the most, but done the less.
After I left school, I had a succession of jobs that I wasn't very happy with. And so when I saw a job on the underground advertised in the newspaper, I said, I'm going to give that a try. And as soon as I started, I found that I liked it. And so I stayed there. And the training was done very well. They would spend the morning in the classroom, and then you'd have lunch, and then in the afternoon you would go out and see what you had learned in the classroom in practice on a train very much like this one behind me. Back in 1973 when I started, all of our braking was done by friction, and so there was a lot of work in changing the brake blocks that stopped the trains. And the foreman would say you have to do 6 months of brake blocking, and if you can survive that, you can survive anything. The rest of the job was concerned dealing with any defects or delays or problems on a train in service. So I was based at Earl's Court for the last 15 years or so of my working life. A bit like the AA man does for cars, I did for trains. One of the things we used to do when we were young men on nights, if we were waiting for a train, was some of the trains, this is really naughty actually, it's a disgraceful thing to do. Some of the trains had fluorescent tubes for lighting, and some of them had ordinary light bulbs. And what we would do was somebody would chuck a fluorescent tube right up into the roof of the depot, and then we tried to shoot it down with light bulbs. And so there was an awful lot of broken glass lying on the depot floor, and a terrible wastage of light bulbs and tubes. It was an absolutely disgraceful thing to do, but it was real fun, and we enjoyed ourselves very greatly. In the 1950s, because our management paid very poor wages, and because all of our work is shift work, or nearly all of our work is shift work, and a lot of people didn't want to do shift work, they found it very difficult to recruit staff. And so they first went over to Ireland and asked people to come in from Ireland to work on the Underground. Then they went to the West Indies and asked people from the Caribbean to come over and work on the Underground, which they did. And then they went to India and Pakistan and asked people to come from those countries. So it's had a very large effect, a massive effect. And some of the white workers didn't feel very comfortable about working with ethnic minority people. So the social events that the union organised were extremely important. There were also sports clubs which were used to be organised by London Transport, which had much the same effect. And so yes, a lot of good friends were made that way. I think I'll choose Boston Manor as my favourite station. Architecturally, it's one of the Charles Holden designed Art Deco stations. I worked on the District Line for 35 years and I never had any desire to work anywhere else. I think there are two nice things about it. The first is that it goes out to nice places in the country. When it comes out of the tunnels, it goes to Richmond, it goes to Wimbledon, which are quite pleasant routes. And the other aspect of it is it's an interesting line. Something like the Victoria Line, it just runs up and down, and it could be a bit boring. But the District Line goes to all kinds of different places and has quite a lot of variety to it.
I thought that I could become a bus driver and I would learn to navigate London roads, etc. And the minute they saw me, they said, "Nope, you're too short." Yeah, so I couldn't work for the buses. And then they said, "Well, you live in Northwest London and we need people to work on the Underground in Northwest London. Why don't you go upstairs where they're recruiting?" And so I thought, well, why not? I went upstairs, they gave me the information. They made it sound like you're going to be a cog in a big wheel and you're going to be doing a really important job and you're going to keep London running, you're going to keep London on the move. And I thought, oh yeah, that sounds really important. That sounds like a good thing to do. And I signed up and I took all the tests. And then a few months later, I got the call that I was employed. Before we actually went to work on the stations, we had to go to a training center which was in White City. I went there and they made it feel very sort of military. And they made it feel like we were joining the army, and we were put in a bus and we were taken down to Chiswick where they were sorting us out various uniforms, and they were quite strict with us. And I thought, well, what's going on? Have I joined the army or something? My first job was working on the stations on the Metropolitan line, and I had to do things like cleaning and sweeping and helping people and giving them directions and dealing with tickets. And they were much, much more run down than they are now. The stations were really, really filthy, especially places, big stations like Liverpool Street. The train driver training was far more difficult because we had to learn a lot about what to do when trains break down. I did meet Hannah Dadds. Yeah, Hannah Dadds was the very first woman who passed her driver's exam and became a driver. And because there were so few women in the 1980s, there were sometimes meetings where we got together to sort of compare stories and to cry on each other's shoulders. There wasn't overt discrimination in terms of either pay or anything like that, but there was a lot of very, very harsh treatment. There was a lot of people who would say things to us which were quite insulting, who would put us down. The hours of work were very, very difficult because it's a 24-hour service. So 1 week you would be starting at 5:10 in the morning, and then the next week you would be starting at 3:30 in the afternoon, and then the next week you would be starting at 11 at night. You never had a regular sort of pattern. It was very, very disruptive. We had reasonable pay, reasonable pay. And the reason we had reasonable pay was to make up for all of the disadvantages. A lot of people tend to complain. They say, oh, they get paid so well and they're always on strike and they're always making trouble and they're always complaining. And I'm saying, well, if you think they get paid so well, why don't you go and take the job? I was very lucky. I worked on the Metropolitan line, so as I was driving out in the open, I wasn't stuck down underground in the tubes. And very, very early in the morning, and you could see the sun rising. You could see the sun rising over Harrow on the Hill. And I would drive out into the country, out to Amersham or out to Watford, and I'd see cows in the fields, and I'd see little foxes playing, and I'd see the rivers and the streams and things. And I'd say, this, I can't believe I'm getting paid for this. This doesn't feel like work. This feels like pleasure. Uxbridge is a lovely sort of building. It has sort of stained glass and it has beautiful lighting and it has a lovely clock there. The staff were very friendly, but the main reason is because I met the love of my life at Uxbridge Station. My boyfriend, my fellow who was also working there, and this was almost 30 years ago.
My inspirations come from knowing my father worked for the Underground and his father before him. Of course, that was a nice thing to follow on from. What I also found great inspiration from generally was the engineers, the Brunels of this world. I always liked hearing about the work they did, going to see the places they created, like the Rotherhithe Tunnel. I was always very practical, and as a child I always wanted Father Christmas to bring me bells, batteries and wire and switches to play with. So I always wanted to be a practical sort of engineer. So engineering was really what I wanted to do in my career. My father worked for the Underground, and that meant that I was in and out of underground offices and buildings quite a lot, even when I was small. When I got all my exams, I applied to London Transport then, and I got a job as a trainee engineer, and they sent me to university. My first day was almost like going to school in a way, because you're sitting there almost in a classroom, talking to other people, talking to the people you just started with, and hearing about the big organisation almost for the first time. So it was a very ordinary day. After I finished my university studies, I got a job in the engineering organisation Acton Works, where trains were developed, maintained and repaired. And so I started working on the buying of new trains. I helped a project manager with the buying of new trains for the Underground. I moved on and did some testing at Ealing Common Depot. I then moved to developing underground train designs, and I helped to work up the specifications for some of the trains on the Central Line. What I feel about the Underground is really that it is part of London's fabric. I like the idea that it's a public service, that it moves people from A to B and does it right. I think that's a great thing to do for society, and that's part of the reason why I do my work. But I stick with London Underground through thick and thin, I think, because it is very much, if you like, a social organisation. The people do hang together. They work together. In my experience, it's been a pretty happy outfit by and large. It's almost like a family. There's always been that sense of camaraderie, of friendship, and of being cared for one by another. It's been quite a good experience, I'd say.
I had a train operator call me up to say that he thought there was a person going to jump onto the track at Warren Street. So I advised the train operator on the train behind to change from automatic to manual and travel with a reasonable speed. Expect somebody to jump in front of him at Warren Street. Eventually, when he got to Warren Street, he said she did. I said, "Did you hit her?" He said, "No, he stopped before she actually got to her." I got £5 for that.
Oh yes, I was doing the toilet one day and this woman coming on because I didn't let her use the toilet for free. She hit me. So I had to use a broom handle on her. And she called my supervisor and she said I hit her. So supervisor said, well, you hit her first. And she turned to him and said, well, I'm white and you are white and she's black. So that means she should hit me and get away with it and he should take up for her. And he said, no, he said, you assault my staff, he said.
In the early days, the trade unions were often equally racist, they were equally sexist, they didn't want to accept women, they didn't want to accept black or Asian people. But I would say we managed to change that. We managed to change that view so that in the end those unions did begin to stand up for and fight for those people. Because otherwise those people would have said, well, why should we be part of your union if you don't support us? Quite rightly.
One of the things I'd like people to sort of think about in regard to what I do, as I said, a trade union representative, is a contribution to make the railway work, you know, because when people think of union and think of strikes and so on, you think of it as something obstructive or stopping something. But in many cases we strike for safety. We strike because the things that people are asking us to do are unsafe, both for us as workers and for the passengers.
I didn't really want to work for London Underground, but I didn't have a job. So I applied for whatever jobs were going, and I got offered a job on London Underground and offered a job in a factory. But I didn't want to work shifts, didn't want to work night times and all those horrible shifts. So I worked in the factory. But after 3 weeks, they found out I was a union man. So they sacked me. So I had to come and work for London Underground as a guard. My earliest memory is when I first started in 1981. They gave us all brand new uniforms and we were to train us. And they sent us onto the station in a group while they were training us. And because I was in uniform, people started asking me questions, but I couldn't answer them because it was my first day. I worked on the carriage just like this. In fact, I probably worked in this carriage, opening and closing doors, which was quite interesting. But all the passengers going to work or coming home were sitting next to you. So sometimes if there was funny people, it got a little bit worrying. I'm a train driver now. One time somebody jumped in front of my train and he stood on the rails with his arms stretched out, wanting to kill himself. I stopped the train, so that was okay, and he just stood there looking at me and I was looking at him. We didn't know what to do, and then he sat on the edge of the platform and one of the platform staff grabbed him from behind in a bear hug and walked backwards and pulled him away. And they asked me if I was okay to carry on driving and move the train, and I said yes, I'm okay. But when I looked at my hand was shaking like that. Well, the Underground's been quite good. As I said, it's just as they didn't victimise people for being union people, which is one of the reasons I came to work there. They didn't discriminate against immigrants, whereas there was perhaps some hidden discrimination if your face didn't fit in some of the other companies. But then they started cutting jobs and privatising. So, for example, the people who cleaned the trains used to have a job working for London Underground, and they'd have a pension and they would work there for London Underground. Same as the stations were cleaned by station staff. During the rush hours, they'd stand on the platform and check the trains, and then when it was quiet, they'd sweep the platform. But to cut jobs,
they put it out to cleaning companies who paid rubbish money, and they would employ people on the very lowest wages that they could. And the peculiar thing is, when you talk to the managers working in the offices, they all think they run London Underground. But when you talk to all the people working on the stations and the trains, they think they run London Underground, despite all the people in the offices. Both sides don't understand each other at all, so it's very peculiar. When the Labour government, the last Labour government got in, they said they were against it, but then they brought in a kind of privatisation for London Underground. They couldn't quite make up their mind to privatise it fully, so they brought in a funny thing called the PPP, and they gave all of the stations, all of the trains, all of the track, all of the maintenance and everything to private companies. And everybody knew it was a nonsense. So some years later it finally all fell apart. But there you go, that should be a lesson to them. But I don't think they're going to learn it. They'll keep coming up with different ways of trying to privatise. My favourite underground station is Stamford Brook. And the reason I like Stamford Brook is it's a funny station, because the original station was built in Victorian times, and it's got quaint old Victorian wooden parapets on the platforms. But then the other half of the station was built in the 1930s in what was then called a modernist style. And so when you look at the station, it just looks very peculiar, and it always makes me laugh when I drive my train through it.
Yeah, I always wanted to be a train driver. So when I got the opportunity and they were recruiting for the Underground, I thought, whoopee, I'll do that. Northern Line is very much underground a lot of the time, and for an hour and a half one would be underground and maybe only for 20 minutes overground. Or if one was really unlucky, we would get a Golders Green, Morden or Kennington Loop return, which would just be underground to underground, underground to underground all day, and there would be no daylight at all. There's certain places in the underground system, very central, that are really fast, and they are like in a hill. When you're in the tunnel, you can see the platform right below you. You can see the light, and it's like a roller coaster. That's pretty exciting. And you have to start braking at the top of the hill, because there's the light of the platform right down there. Because if you don't start braking now, you go straight through the platform without stopping. And there's another place at Camden. You know, Camden's got 2 branches. And the trains, if they're coming towards you, it looks like you're going to crash, because it looks like you're coming straight on to another train heading straight on, and then they swing off at the last minute. It's very exciting. So yeah, that's pretty cool. I was assaulted a couple of times by passengers, and I guess that was the worst experience for me. It was pretty traumatic. I was pushed off the train in my guard's place on one occasion while the train was still moving, because I have permission to open my guard's door while the train is pulling into a platform or pulling out of a platform. There were particular incidences where I was picked on, you know, as being a female in a very male environment, being train crew. I was really upset by it. It didn't affect me to the point that I was going to give up my job, because this was the job that I'd been waiting for. I'd always wanted to be a train driver, so no, that wasn't going to put me off. I just knew that I had to put on a bit more of a tougher exterior and get right in there and just give them as good as they were giving me, sort of thing. There was a big competition about trying to master the Westinghouse brake, which was the big boys. The big boys could do the Westinghouse brake. I mean, I'm very competitive, so I mastered it, and therefore I got my stripes. You know, I was a good driver. But there was one time on the Central Line, we used to play tricks on other drivers. Before we reached the platform, we stopped the train and we put some detonators down on the track. Now, detonators are like little explosives, which we always carry in the train. It's really to warn the next train if something, they need to stop. So we put one at a certain distance, so they get one bang, and then two after another certain stopping distance, two bang, you know, like that. It's a bit bigger, and then three, which will actually derail a train in the cause of safety, because there may be something on the track and they haven't stopped in time, which that would actually derail the train. And we did, for a joke, we did 2 detonators, so we knew it would be pretty safe. And we knew the train that went past, we just smiled as they went past opposite side, going into Epping, and we're going away. We'd put these 2 detonators down on each of the tracks, and the running tracks. And then when we got to, I think it was Loughton, we heard that there was a train derailed at Debden. We were really, I don't know how to describe it, sort of part frightened, a little bit. It was hilarious. We was laughing, but also we knew the seriousness. We derailed a train.
The job I enjoyed the most was when I was a duty train manager. I got to go to all the incidents, deal with all, a bit like being a sort of a firefighter, if you like, going around dealing with incidents as they happen, making sure the railway got up and running again. That's the job I enjoyed the most. Yeah, I remember when I first joined, and people were smoking in carriages on trains. So you could sit in a carriage in the early morning and it would be dirty, filthy, cigarette ends anywhere. And you could almost open the doors and a puff of smoke would come out of the carriage. It's a really horrible place to be. Yeah, certainly when we had the terrorist bombings, it was something that none of us had ever been through, not to that level at all. We'd had little things before, but that really was a sad day that so many people lost their lives on the system that day. We'd had tragedies before, like the King's Crossfire, but this was different. This was a deliberate act by people. And to a certain extent we didn't know where some of our own people were during the day, because we'd lost all communication, so it was a very sad and traumatic time for a lot of us. I think the best time at work, maybe not my best day, but it was during the Olympics last year. I think that was a really special time for us in London. I really enjoyed getting back out and doing some of the jobs I'd previously done, helping out. That was really, really exciting time for us.
I'm a passenger most of the time. I don't work for London Underground, but I do drawings on London Underground. I like the kind of 1930s underground stations, 1920s and 1930s. So there are some stations where I live. There's Clapham South and Tooting Broadway. They've got these lovely rounded shapes. And then, I don't know if you've been to it, but St James's Park has got a lovely old-fashioned station, and it's got old-fashioned shops inside, and it's got sculptures on the outside. What I do is I draw people's feet, so I don't draw their faces. I just look down, and then whoever's come on the tube, I'm just drawing their sort of from their knees downwards and their feet. I think when people sit down, they make quite nice shapes, and also because I don't see very well, so that distance between me sitting on one side and the person on the other side isn't very far. So they're quite good. They're just quite good things to draw, and everybody sits differently. You could sort of tell people's characters by how they sit. And then the other thing about the Underground is people don't really like eye contact. They don't, it seems, it's almost quite threatening. People get very uncomfortable if you look at them straight. Sometimes people will get on and I'll think, oh, they've got really good shoes on, or that's quite interesting, all those 4 people together. I've just drawn whoever came on the tube, and I'm on the Northern Line here. the tube lines are different colours. So I thought I would do the black for the Northern line and purple for the Metropolitan line. And this one, so you can see I've got this chap. He took up about 3 seats, and then on the Jubilee line, everyone's it's very crowded near Oxford Circus. And then there was someone with sandals this morning. And then today, I was on the Victoria line, and it was really hot. So today, everybody's in shorts. They're just snatches of people. And then the different lines, depending on the time of day, you'll get different groups of people coming on the train, and sometimes it's really squashed together, and sometimes I think, I'd like to do a drawing of somebody, and there's nobody in the carriage, so I can't do one. And then sometimes it's too crowded to even get your book out because you're squashed in like a sardine.